So let's look at what they initially proposed back in November of last year, almost 1 year to the date. And this was the original 1.0 rendering. And you can kind of see that they've buffed up the rendering here to a point where it's a little bit more robust. You have a few extra amenities incorporated in this 2.0 rendering and envisioning to a point where back to the 1.0, this is where they were projecting a $1.6 billion budget. And since then, once again, with them buffing up the riverfront a little bit more so in 2.0, not to mention over the last year, the increase in construction costs. Back to my point of kind of stating the fact that 1.6 I think is off. I think they're probably looking at closer to $2 billion for this redevelopment. What's going on, folks? Eddie Carrington, mayor of Flux City, and today we are reacting to some pretty interesting news that Bedrock and GM announced earlier today with regard to the RenCen. And if you're not too familiar with the RenCen, this is or was GM's headquarters up until recent, where they decided to move into the Hudson building, which also is owned by Bedrock. But GM is left with hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space and underutilized space with regard to this site that has been a staple to the Detroit skyline for some time. And what they're wanting to do is reimagine this site into a redevelopment that is projected to cost close to $1.6 billion as of today, which I'm going to assume is going to balloon to closer to $2 billion when it's all said and done. But this is a site that the city of Detroit as a whole does not want to see disappear. The city does not want this site completely demoed. We want to see it saved and adaptively reused into something greater. When Bedrock and GM initially announced the opportunity to redevelop this site and to reimagine it, they came up with some imagery that, in comparison to what we see today, is a stark difference. I'm pretty excited to see what they've kind of went back to the drawing board with and came back with. And so we're gonna kind of talk a little bit about that, check those images out, and I'm gonna give you a few of my thoughts here. So let's jump right into it. So let's start here. Detroit's RenCen to get $75 million in public funding. It's kind of a drop in the bucket per se, because this redevelopment is projected to take, as of today, $1.6 billion, which I would assume is going to increase because the cost of construction is constantly rising, even past the point with which construction costs were at when COVID was a thing. And I never thought I'd see the day this soon to see construction costs per square foot be higher than what it was during COVID. But here we are. I digress a little bit. Looking at this image, this is gorgeous, right? We're going to look at what it looked like previous to this image, because they came up with some 1.0 renderings that they shared with the community a few months back, maybe closer to a year. And so seeing the progression of what they are envisioning for this site, this is what we're talking about, right? This is a city center that will attract hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people a year, because everything is encompassed and incorporated in this development, in this site. People can stay, eat, entertainment. They're doing their best at creating an environment and a dock that attracts cruise ships. So imagine you hopping on a cruise ship from the Detroit River, which I know there's one cruise ship that at the very least makes Detroit one of their many stops. It's not their starting point, but it's one of their stops that they make. but what if there is a cruise ship that actually starts their journey right here from the Detroit River? And I actually think that could happen. But once again, I digress. The Downtown Development Authority has pledged $75 million to support Bedrock and GM's plan to revitalize Detroit's RenCen and riverfront. This funding is a key part of the local and state backing needed to redevelop the RenCen and turn the surrounding riverfront into a premier mixed-use waterfront district, according to the release from Bedrock. I mean, we're living in some exciting times. I really think that this is one of many examples of just how far Detroit is coming along with the rebirth of this great city. It's time to take Detroit serious. I see a lot of residents that don't realize this expansion that is happening right before our eyes. And it's usually because development here in the city is so slow and sluggish that you don't realize just how much and what is happening until it's complete. So imagine looking up in 2033, this site has been fully redeveloped, and you're reading these articles and you're like, that'll never happen. But then once again, 6, 7, 8 years later, you're walking the riverfront and you're like, wow. I didn't believe that this was possible, but these entities have the capacity to be able to execute a development such as what we're being presented today. Bedrock and GM, they can make something like this happen, especially with the support that they're looking to gain from the state side. So, wow. The funds will also help demolish the confusing podium base of the complex, undoing the previous design that made the RenCen a fortress-like city within a city. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, if you were to make the RenCen a city within the city, let's imagine you just keep the current footprint and you convert a majority of the square footage to residential. Right now, it's 90% office space with another small percentage in hotel space and restaurants and things of that nature. But if you made this an actual city where people could live within this encompassed facility, I actually think that that could work as well. And that may not necessarily take $1.6 billion, but it wouldn't necessarily beautify the Detroit River in comparison to what they're presenting to us today. So I don't necessarily make the fortress like city within the city sound bad. I feel like that could actually work as well. In addition to the $75 million commitment, the redevelopment project is also supported by $1 billion investment from Dan Gilbert and Bedrock and $250 million from GM. So if this is gonna cost $1.6 billion, and yet Dan Gilbert and GM are already willing to front 1.25 million or $1 billion to the execution and to the capital stack of this project. Plus, they got another $75 million from DDA. They're not that far off from actually getting the capital stack fulfilled and in a position to be able to execute this redevelopment. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when they're going to be starting the demolition of this site. And that makes this project even more exciting. Bedrock and GM proposed a once in a lifetime opportunity to remove the barrier, seamlessly connect the heart of our city to the river, and further expand public access, amenities, as well as preserve an iconic aspect of our skyline. CEO of the Downtown Detroit Partnership, Eric Lawson, stated that few organizations would have the vision, capacity, and commitment to take on such a transformative project. The Downtown Detroit Partnership strongly supports and applauds this bold vision that honors our city's history while advancing its future and reflects the aspirations of our community for generations to come. And I couldn't agree more. Like, this is something that the only entities and organizations and people that can make something like this is a Dan Gilbert and a GM, because they're on the hook for what happens to the site. So that makes sense. Beautiful rendering here. You can kind of see that they're trying to make it a little bit more walkable and attached and connected to Jefferson, right? And so this looks like it creates a massive crosswalk across Jefferson and into this plaza. And it's also intriguing to see the streetscape work. Looks like they're updating in this proposal. It looks like they are showing an updated streetscape that incorporates a little bit more of a robust build out of bike lanes. I don't know if I've seen that in past renderings. So that's pretty cool to see. Really pedestrian friendly, really open. I see a car pulling out here. I'm not sure if they're indicating that this is potentially a road as well, but I don't necessarily understand why that car is there. I would assume that this is probably going to be cut off for vehicles to drive through. Maybe that was a mistake. I could be wrong. So let's look at what they initially proposed back in November of last year, almost 1 year to the date. And this was the original 1.0 rendering. And you can kind of see that they've buffed up the rendering here to a point where it's a little bit more robust. You have a few extra amenities incorporated in this 2.0 rendering and envisioning to a point where back to the 1.0, this is where they were projecting a $1.6 billion budget. And since then, once again, with them buffing up the riverfront a little bit more so in 2.0, not to mention over the last year, the increase in construction costs. Back to my point of kind of stating the fact that 1.6 I think is off. I think they're probably looking at closer to $2 billion for this redevelopment. Back to 1.0, still looks pretty solid, right? Even though we're deleting two of the five structures, it still keeps the same skyline to a point where a lot of Detroiters would be happy, because we don't want to see it disappear fully. This was a Coleman Young creation, and Coleman Young, you got to do a little research on Coleman Young, but a lot of Detroiters respect what he did for the city. Hate him or love him, he definitely made his imprint and his mark on Detroit. So and the GM building is one of those many marks that he made. One more view of the 1.0. Once again, this doesn't have as much going on as 2.0 does. And so it looks good in both scenarios. It looks phenomenal. And I would support either option, but I'm leaning towards 2.0 because that's just gorgeous, right? And you can kind of see a little bit more of a close up here where the river walk is already active and used by many Detroiters throughout the year. Incorporating a stage here, I mean that's just gorgeous. Here's that cruise ship that they're envisioning here, which is a real thing. A cruise ship does come to the city and once again makes a stop here. But I'm hoping that I can hop on the cruise ship here and be able to take a real cruise without having to hop on an airplane to fly out to Florida, right? I would really, really dig an opportunity to just hop on a cruise ship here and kind of take a Midwest cruise. It doesn't necessarily have to go to too many places. I just love the idea to be able to hop on a cruise ship right from the Detroit River. I think that'd be cool. So as prominent as the RenCen is to our skyline and just how many people kind of identify the RenCen to the city of Detroit, it's really disconnected to the rest of downtown Detroit. Unfortunately, it's off the beaten path, and luckily this development has that opportunity to kind of change the fate of the RenCen and to better connect it to the whole of downtown Detroit. And I think that is extremely, extremely valuable for this site to be interconnected a little bit more intentionally in comparison to how it is now. Really excited to kind of see this unfold. But this is still really the beginning stages of this redevelopment. And so I'm pretty sure I'm going to be covering a lot more regarding the redevelopment of the RenCen. Enough rambling for today. Let me know your thoughts. What are your thoughts about 2.0 versus 1.0? And if you think that the $1.6 billion price tag on this redevelopment is too high, too low, would you rather see this site demoed completely? What would you rather see or want to see at this site? See you in the next video.